This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Loriel Beltrán. Beltran is a Venezuelan American painter based in Miami who creates captivating paintings through a unique and labor-intensive process, which involves pouring layers upon layers of paint into a form. And once dried, the block of dried paint is sliced into thin strips and reassembled on a flat surface. The result is unique and mesmerizing. Beltran sits down to talk about his unique process, its origins, and his new show at Lehman Maupin in New York. And now, a conversation about creating a painting one slice at a time with artist Loriel Beltrán. Loriel Beltrán, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Loriel, you're a painter. I know that you currently are part of a group exhibit with Lehman Maupin's location in Palm Beach. And I'm actually speaking to you today from Lehman Maupin's gallery in New York. And so maybe we could start at a place where I start with a lot of artists, which is if you're at a dinner party and you were sitting next to someone who has no idea who you are or what you do, how do you start to describe your work to a stranger?
I guess I would say they're paintings, but they start as objects. So, it's not very traditional painting. At the end, they look very much like paintings. But I like to stress that they start from, building this object. And then that object gets sliced by a machine that I have custom built. And then those get laid onto a wood panel. So, there's a sort of a translation that happens between this three-dimensional space and the two-dimensional space. And also a translation of, the time sort of, building up this painting. I like to say that they grow, because it's a slow process that involves, gravity and humidity and all these things that affect every layer. So there's things that I can control and things that I cannot control. And so I like to think of them as, that I'm growing paintings.
So you mentioned a couple of things there that probably beg some explanation for people that are listening to us versus showing folks a picture, which is your process starts with you creating an object, which is like a slab, and that is created, and you can help explain this for my listeners, but that's created using layers of paint poured into a mold, and that there's kind of an archaeological principle going on there, right?
Yes, it's it's archaeological, geological. It's like building strata. It's like one layer and then another layer. So it's once it's cut, you see this register of every layer that was there. Pretty much it's a rectangular mold where I, pour the layers, and sometimes I also put other pieces of paint that create, interruptions. And then that, when that is finished, that's what gets sliced and presented.
That step of the process is rather sculptural, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess, sculpture kind of applies itself to several aspects of what you're doing. But once that mold is dry, you have something like a bandsaw that's almost slicing it like meat at a deli into these strips that you then lay flat across a surface. Those cross sections are what we wind up seeing applied to the surface, right?
Yeah, exactly. The only thing I would say, the machine is more like a guillotine than a bandsaw.
Okay.
Because previously I tried bandsaws and table saws and all these things, and anything that creates friction burns the paint. So this is it's just like a guillotine blade on a hoist that gets pulled, with a lot of force, and it just cuts straight. I don't know, just technical difference there, but I think it makes you visualize it a little more. It's literally like a controlled guillotine.
Then that winds up, again, being applied onto a surface. I've seen images of you applying it to things that are a little bigger and structural. But how do you wind up applying those slices onto the surface? Are those like adhered with like PVA, or do you put wet paint down and apply the slices of paint to a wet surface? How is that adhering?
It's just wood glue. The wood glue adheres really well to the paint, and then it adheres really well to the wood panel, and it's pretty simple.
So that process, at this point, we've kind of talked about, how, but that really doesn't talk a lot about the visual component. I mean, there are lots of different ways that we can look at these things, and from a distance, some of the pieces, they almost appear like digital glitch art, which is interesting because, I see in your bio that you actually have a degree in electronic media and art history. And has that ever struck you that some of these look like, the glitches on digital media?
Yeah, I mean, I did study that, but I barely did anything digital afterwards. But I think that that aspect comes from the fact that like these are almost like a code, like I decide like, okay, I'm going to use this palette that has this many colors and I'm going to do this many layers. And so there's this like, they start in a very sort of rational way, kind of like, you would be coding, and then the code sort of gets, run, right, as I pour them. And then like a lot of things happen in between that process that really, to me, is what makes the work interesting. If they were very clean and perfect, I think they wouldn't be so interesting. So in a way, it's almost like running these like analog codes, and a lot of people, see the digital, but also, I like that they collapse a lot of categories because they're digital, but they're geological, and they sort of remind you of a lot of things that maybe use similar processes.
In the course of your creating, as you're putting together the slabs and you're making choices about colors and the depth of layers and what other objects you bury in that slab, have you gotten to the point where you can anticipate fully what the piece is going to look like as it unfolds? Or, is there still a strong sense of surprise in your work as it evolves?
There's a strong sense of surprise. I have a rough idea of what to expect, but it never really matches what I really thought beforehand. And in a way that keeps driving me to, for the next piece, because sometimes I want to see something and I just don't quite get there. And, I have to try it a different way, or maybe I learn something new from them and it's exciting and I want to follow that direction. So there's always this sort of blind process where I sort of think what I want, make it, and then once I cut it, I realize what I've been working on for the past few months and sort of informs the next production.
One of the other things that the work reminds me of is the work of the like 1960s op art. The strong linear repetition, especially with the stark contrast in some of the colors sometimes, really kind of reminds me of that. And I guess there is some real blow to our eyes as we see some of those patterns, right?
Yeah, so my relationship with op art is kind of like, I guess that's why it's important to see it in person, because I do come, I'm from Venezuela, where there's a huge, big tradition of, optical art, kinetic art there. But a lot of the work is always very perfect and like very clean and very sort of like idealistic. It has all these like modernist utopian ideals and, all these things that I, reject, and I think when you see them in person and you realize the materiality of the paint, and you see, that these are objects, I like that tension between this object that, gives an illusion, but it's not an illusion at all. These are layers that are structural. These are, so there's this tension between the optical and the material that I find very interesting. Yeah, like, I guess I'm more interested in the idea of perception than in opticality, even though they're related, you access this sort of like perceptual, it's like you access like this this world beyond language through perception, but I'm not necessarily interested in like an optical illusion.
When I look at your website and are able to see some of your older work, a lot of that was really beautiful figuration, and then there was a shift. Can you kind of talk about what led to your current body of work?
Yeah, like I this body of work I've been focused on, and I've been, it's very exciting. I'm very, like right now I'm very focused, but it's not what I've been doing this whole, I mean, I've been doing this for like 20 years, so I've done a lot of different things. And when you see them visually, they maybe not relate so obviously, but there's definitely a relationship and a thread that goes through my work. So I'll start you with, in 2009, I did a project, Locust Project in Miami, where I, I ripped the paint that was on the walls, because they had been in that space for 10 years and the space was painted pink and then white and then green and then white and, maybe a mural and then white. So I realized it was the same layering as I was doing in my studio, but in this case, it was, one for keeping the white cube effect, and two, it was, considered labor. And many times I was doing that labor. That's kind of how I became aware of it, because I was working at Locust Projects, assisting the artists and painting the walls. So I became interested in this idea of like my artistic labor and like my regular labor. So I peeled the paint off the walls. I cut it and showed the cross section of the gallery, you know, and then the paintings were installed on the bare walls, with the brown paper of, that holds the plaster together. So in a way, it was the same process, but it was like taking it out of the studio and into this world of like, labor and the architecture of the space and the white cube effect, and like dealing with these things that were outside of my studio. And that led me to work with other things, sort of, institutional critique, sort of, thinking where I was working with like shipping crates that were discarded from shipping artworks, and, sort of creating these structures out of them. And, and with those, I showed some photography that I had taken many years earlier, but it made sense, of these buildings in Miami that had a bunch of their windows blown out by a hurricane. So they put some plywood panels on top of them, creating this sort of like invisible, making the wind, which is invisible, sort of gridded and like tangible. So there are a lot of relationships in my work, like visibility, accumulation, just things that, maybe are not obvious, and, somehow they become, much more visible. And then, I was thinking also of, architecture, and maybe taking some of these ideas of institutional critique outside of like the art world and thinking of them more like socially. So this was like the time of after the 2008 crash. A lot of Miami felt it really, really strongly, because Miami is so much about, uh, Miami is just it's a young city, and a lot of people went crazy buying houses. And so I actually made some sculptures out of some of the leftovers of that crisis, using marble and granite countertops that, people were sort of ripping off their homes before the banks would take them away. So, and that sort of led me, to looking at a lot of the like sort of vernacular architecture in Miami. I'm always looking, like I might be making one body of work, but I'm always looking at a lot of different things. I look at architecture and urban planning. I'm thinking about a lot of other things that end up informing, my work. And then the figurative works that you were talking about, I was sort of, I wanted to get back to painting after a while, and I had laid a bunch of the layers, and they had a lot of blocks of paint for cutting, and I failed cutting them by hand, and I tried a lot of things, and the bandsaw and the table saw, and a hand cutter and a turkey cutter, and nothing was working. So that work I literally put aside for many years until I could figure out a machine, for cutting that. So that's when I was making all these, like sculptures and installations, and I even opened an artist-run space with two other artists, Aramis Gutierrez and Domingo Castillo. So, we did 4 years of programming. So, we did a lot of other things. And this figurative works that you're talking about, I was thinking of, I wanted to get back to painting, and I was having a hard time, figuring out where to start painting in Miami because it feels like there's no context or there's no history of painting. And painting is such a historical medium that you sort of feel like, you got to start somewhere. And the advertisements around the city just kept kind of calling me, and, like, this is the aesthetic history of the city. It grew out of advertising, of the paradise, and, and advertising is also transient and it's sort of, like sexy. And, so I'm like, wow, this is very Miami, So I started taking a lot of the bus shelter posters and painting on them and magazine pages. But with the magazine pages, I realized like a lot of the fashion advertising were just using art history, like it's like the Renaissance and, chiaroscuro and, the 19th century. And I started to look at these as this like cyclical, almost like art historical flow of images that were going through magazines, So in a way, I was just like painting on top of them to simplify them and taking from, from the specific to the general, and that way connecting them back to that history. So instead of seeing, Angelina Jolie posing for Louis Vuitton, which is like, once you see the symbols, you sort of don't really look at the image. But once you like sort of simplify it and you see just like this pastoral figure in this landscape, then you connect it back to the history of painting. So in a way, like, they are not layered, but like as a group, they really form this sort of like historical thread, and this like sort of cyclical idea that I think runs through a lot of my work.
So do you feel like it's important for your work to reference art history, to be part of a dialogue with artwork that's come before?
Yeah, I think all art is going to reference, art history. I see art history as a resource in a way, it's there. It's something, we have this accumulation of culture and conventions and palettes. And so I feel that, this is something that it's almost like a material, that I think about and that I bring into the work. And in a way, it makes, these very simple paintings that are based of line and color, they, once you start coding them in these sort of all these ideas and all this baggage that painting brings, then this very simple sort of gesture or buildup of material becomes a lot more complex when it's, when you look at it and it still relates to this broad history.
Do you think there's anything about your work that conveys the fact that that you're Venezuelan? I mean, like, I know I see the primary colors used a lot, which, are the colors of the Venezuelan flag. I mean, sometimes we can't escape our roots, just kind of comes out in our work. How do you think your work reflects your roots?
Well, I would never make a work about a flag because I try to always run away from the symbolic, nationalism, like all those things. I just really like stay away from. But I think, the idea of making work with line and color, like it's subconsciously probably very Venezuelan. Like the history of art in Venezuela is, pretty much line and color, sometimes combined and sometimes not. And at first I didn't really think about it. I was making this work sort of because I wanted to see these things. And then it became obvious that this is sort of where they're starting, like for me to make something that's just line and color and that's sort of being like a default, it makes complete sense that, yeah, this is what I've been looking at. And, so yeah, I think it's a starting point. But, as I was saying earlier, like I really, I respect a lot of, like Cruz Diaz and Soto and Otero and, all these artists, but I think they were definitely in a different, it was a different time of like very like optimistic, sort of modernist utopianism, that you just can't have that position anymore. We've seen how that just hasn't really, delivered the promises that, were made, so in a way, like maybe one of the Venezuelan artists that I still look at and, like that I feel, um, is still an influence would be Gable, who just opened her show at the Guggenheim, which is amazing. And I really like how, first of all, like how she would take one element, like this simple line, and, by this operational, you know, sort of, planning, like she makes these things grow, so you get this like little piece of wire of the same size, but by repetition and accumulation and error, it becomes something else, and I feel like a lot of that, like I related to my work very much. So I look at her work a lot. And also thinking, she was trained as an architect. So a lot of her work is very, it's architectural, but not like regular architects where everything is perfect. I love that she sort of takes this idea of space and turns it into this more organic, sort of space, and lets the space define itself, which I think is much more interesting than like a lot of the rigidity of like architectural thought. And, so I find her work to be extremely interesting still.
Do you have specific plans on how you may start experimenting with your process more? Because I mean, I know that you use a lot of linear repetition, but I've seen some works where you're using those same slices as just kind of a material to create abstract forms. It's almost like each of those strips becomes a mark that you can use anywhere on the canvas versus following a rigid repetition. Do you think you'll go more that way, or do you think you want to experiment more with kind of the admiration of the sculptural and architectural that you were just discussing?
I think I'm going to be doing a little bit of both, because all of my work is not about color. But it's been about color for some time, and mainly because I had these questions that, sometimes it's when you have a question of what you want to see, you have to get it done. And little by little, this has led me into other avenues. But so as long as I have questions of color, I'm going to keep exploring color. But I'm also expanding the, sort of the investigation into other areas. So, for example, right now I've been playing with putting some sort of bringing in a lot of the waste from my studio, not only the paint waste, but also on some pieces I've been bringing in some of like the coffee cups and sort of like the ritual of the studio, and a lot of these like non-recyclable plastics and all these things. So like then, I guess I sort of work in like cycles, so in a way I started with these things that were very much questions of art, and now I'm sort of expanding into like more questions of like, like social ideas. So, thinking of the landfill as like also this layered monument that, we're collectively building, so like a lot of this garbage, instead of going into the landfill, now is going into this mold. And now, these things are also like, I like how there's a connection, like, from, to the body, where you put this coffee cup and you drink from it, and then it becomes part of this landscape, So I like this coffee cup sort of connecting the body and the landscape, and thinking of, you know, the landfill as this site that also relates to the museum, where, there's very few places where objects go to die, and the museum is one, and the landfill is another one. I mean, unfortunately, the ocean is it's another place, but I think it's interesting to draw this connection between the landfill and the museum, and this difference between collecting and consuming. So I feel like inserting this sort of waste into the work starts to bring out these questions of, the body and the landscape and consumption, and all these other things.
No, that's really intriguing, and it makes me think that you could go down a path where you could make your works very site specific, where you could actually go to a particular location and record the colors that you see in that location and then collect, waste from that spot and include it into the construction to create, pieces that reflect, specific places, right?
Sure, maybe something like that. I've also, I have other ideas for like specific projects that don't involve paint, that like the crates that I worked on many years ago. I have other ideas where, sort of using these crates to be, site specific and, you create these like massive architecture installations with waste crates because I know they're throwing them out all the time and they sort of, make the art world. So we know at Ron, the art fair and the museum show and so I definitely have a lot of places where I can expand my practice. I'm very interested in this painting, so I've been very focused, and I think I'm still like, there's so many paintings that I want to see that I'm sort of following this path, and see where it leads me.
Well, when people talk about art in Miami, I think most people's minds kind of go to Art Basel Miami Beach, and we think of the whole art world descending once a year, collectors, galleries. But what is the practicality for the artist living in Miami? What is the art community like the other 11 and a half months of the year?
Yeah, it's completely different. It's great. People think there's nothing going on in Miami, and that's because they're distracted with Basel and there's all these things going on. And I mean, and look, I think it's great that we have this event that we don't have to travel to, that it comes to our door, and we go and we meet people and we see things, and it's great. But people are not there to see Miami. People are not there to see Miami artists or care about what's going on there. So it's funny, like when we had the gallery, the Urban Gallery, for Basel, we always put like, just the most ridiculous shows. Like we did a Christmas show once for our Basel, because it's like, yeah, people are not here for this, like, so we made it more because a lot of friends are in town, and, so we made it more like a sort of festive show that was also making a little bit of fun, because then, of course, everybody's asking you, oh, what are you doing for Basel? What are you doing for Basel? And we're like, oh, we're doing a Christmas show, so yeah, I mean, I think we were poking fun at like this whole like, because there's definitely a lot of people who are trying to do all these things for Basel so that like they could be seen, and I'm realizing that, yeah, like nobody's there for you, like they're there for the big event and for the celebrities and the whole thing, so I think if you only know Miami through Art Basel, then you should, whoever is listening, if you know Miami through Art Basel, you should go at a different time. Even though right now like rents are really out of control, and like, like I feel like a lot of the sort of like homegrown, like smaller things that really were keeping Miami alive are very hard to maintain now, just because of the prices, and so I mean, I hope things just get a little easier so that we still have that, because I feel like we're losing it a little bit, because the prices just don't make sense anymore. And if we lose that, then that will be a real tragedy for Miami, because I think that's what really keeps the city interesting and alive in terms of art.
Sure. So what is on your calendar this year? Do you have? I know you're currently in a group show there at Lehman Maupin. What else is on the horizon for you this year?
I actually have a show that opens here in New York today with Lehman Maupin, a solo show. I think it runs till April 29th. I could be wrong. I have to check, but I think that's the date.
For those folks that are able to come out to see it, what will they find?
A small group of paintings. It's not the big main space. It's downstairs space, which is a beautiful space, but it's a little smaller. They'll find 6 paintings. And look, if you see photos, like you're not seeing the work really. Like, so if anybody's interested, really, you have to see it in person. I get that comment all the time. It's like, oh, I saw your work in images and I didn't care. And now it's like, oh wow, okay, I get it. So yeah, I mean, it's an age of images. It's hard to compete with like, Instagram and how easy it is to like just see stuff. But I feel like a good painting should not be an image, it should be something else. There's so many ways of creating images. There's so many ways of generating, something visual, that I feel like, I want my paintings to challenge that, I want my paintings to be unphotographable. Like, I want you to be there and like look at them, and that's what makes them a painting.
An experience, right?
Exactly.
Well, Loriel, I really appreciate your time today and being willing to open up about your inspirations and your process. I wish you the best of luck with this show, and I'm sure there's been lots of hard work go into preparing for that, and I hope everyone's able to go out and see it in person and experience it the way it's intended to be experienced, right?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.